when I was a kid, just like most kids my age, we were all into the Dukes of Hazzard. And at that age, I was under 10 years old. You kind of understood the Confederate symbolism. Well, I mean, maybe you didn't understand it, but you kind of knew that it was there. I mean, the Confederate flag was on the General Lee, so right there, the Confederate flag right on top of the car, and then it's named after the Confederate leader of the Confederate Armed Forces. But you just took it all in stride as a kid. You didn't really understand the significance of that symbolism, but it was there. I mean, and my grandma, my dad's mom, was a hell of a baker. She'd bake me whatever kind of cake I wanted. And one year as a kid, I wanted a cake at the General Lee. And she made it. No questions asked. No punches pulled. Nothing along those lines. Just carried on. Carried on with how everything's supposed to be. Well, it's just the General Lee. It's just a car. I never really understood, like I said, the significance. I knew the history. I knew about the Civil War. I knew that the North fought the South and the North won. But I really didn't grasp the significance of it until I got older. I mean, I grew up in northern Michigan, so I didn't really see a Confederate flag in person. I mean, I would see it on symbols, on license plates, on stickers, stuff like that. Something minute, well, at least what I thought was minute. I didn't really see a flag in person until I got to college. And I would think it was my second year in college. And I was invited into this room, and before I was even invited into the room, the person that invited me said, "No, don't worry about what's on the wall." And I'm thinking to myself, I've never even been in this room. Why would I worry what's on the wall? And they opened the door, and there it was, a big banner, a big Confederate flag hanging on the wall. And I know that my first reaction was like, I don't want to be here. I don't want to be in this room. And so I said, no, thank you, and left. And I know that was said to me because of the folks that I hung out with, because they were predominantly black. And that person was basically saying, well, don't think that I'm this way, because, I mean, you know what? It's really hard when you go into this situation, and it's right there in your face. It gives you this visceral reaction. I can only imagine what kind of reaction that my friends would have. I'm just thinking about myself. And and growing up, more and more that I saw that, and more anger it created in me seeing that symbol, and especially being someone who lives and has lived in Michigan most of his life. I just don't understand the purpose of the flag. Number one, because if you're here in Michigan, why are you flying this flag? It doesn't matter. We are a state that fought as a union and with the Union Army to defeat the Confederate states, who, by all intents and purposes, should and were considered traitors to the nation because they seceded as a decision of several states to do so and then declared war on the United States. That is a textbook definition of treason. And yet we upheld their traditions and their monuments and symbols and stuff like that, named streets after their quote-unquote heroes. Actually, they're not even quote-unquote heroes. They are traitors. And until I was an adult, I just found out that there was actual monuments in the United States Capitol building of these Civil War era generals. And it really boggles my mind. But going back, thinking about how I grew up and how it was not a big deal, the fact that of the matter that these symbols were still active when I was in my younger self in early 1980s, watching what would seem like a harmless show, actually was probably a very heart-wrenching show for those friends of mine that are African American that grew up the same time I did. I mean, I know that we talked about that show, but not in great length. We talked about that we watched it. That's about it. But there's more to it than that. And, and it was one of my things is like, I didn't grow up in an urban setting. I didn't grow up around Black people. But yet I was exposed to something that was downplayed and something that should not have even been a part of our culture, pop culture or otherwise. Whether or not you say, well, this is Southern heritage, that is not something you uphold, because for the simple fact that the Confederate flags was made to the battle group that fought the United States Army over, because their top tenet was slavery and upholding slavery. It was their right as a state to have slavery. So they thought that was their tenet. But they fought a war, were only around for 4 to 5 years, and lost that war. Yet we still upheld this until today, in which these cracks of dissent against this power that we have over a certain sect of our nation, we have to get rid of that. And we're starting to make those inroads. But I just want it to be known that in my situation, somebody who's journeying through how my white privilege downplayed the whole thing as a young kid, that this is a situation that we got to look at. This is a situation that we can't keep going with. And it's obviously finally getting to a point where people are understanding that. So that's my journey with growing up, understanding what the Confederate flag meant and what it meant to me, which wasn't a good thing. It never has been. However, it's not something that we should have actually had as a nation out there in the first place. Museums, history books, it's one thing. Glorifying these folks as heroes, putting up monuments, displaying symbols, that is American heresy. And our forefathers wouldn't have stood for it. In fact, they built this country on the fact that this isn't something that we would stand for. However, they were all slave owners, well, at least the majority of them, and that's another story for another time. But that's exactly where my journey was when it comes to the Confederate flag and how that played a role in my development and understanding what my white privilege is and where it's going. And that's, until now, that's just been left unsaid. See you next time.